Hello everyone, we're going to continue with option E. Today's lesson we're going to look at E3, innate and learned behavior. Well, here's an interesting picture. What exactly is going on here? We have a baby who is breastfeeding. Would this be an example of innate behavior or learned behavior? What do you think? The answer is innate behavior. A baby doesn't need to be shown how to breastfeed. It will automatically and naturally, from a pre-programmed standpoint, root, which means it will turn its head to try to find the nipple. It will latch onto the nipple and it will start suckling. That's an example of innate behavior. An example of learned behavior would be, let's say, a teenage girl putting on makeup before school, because that's something that we're not born knowing how to do. We have to learn how to do that. I find this slide fascinating from an IB standpoint because they have these very strict guidelines with regard to experimentation that for your IAs you're not allowed to use animals anymore when conducting an IA, although here in topic E, E3.2, the actual prompt is design experiments to investigate innate behavior in invertebrates. So they're kind of going against what they're preaching. But that's sort of beside the point. The real point of this slide is to differentiate between two scientific terms. The first one is taxis, and the second one is kinesis. And the best way to differentiate them is that if you get into a taxi, do you just get in and say, all right, let's go? Or do you get into the car and say, I need to go to the airport? The answer would be B. When you get into a taxi, it's going to take you in a certain direction to a certain place. And a taxis is directional in nature. It's vector-based. So to the right here, you see an example, a picture of a flatworm, common name Planaria, and you'll notice that there are eye spots on the flatworm. These were one of the first animals to develop photoreceptors. Now, they're not fully functioning eyes like we have in our heads, but they can detect light and dark. And so a classic taxis experiment with Planaria is to have them in a tank, because they're water-based animals, and put a really bright light on one end of the tank and observe their behavior. So the question would be, do you think that the Planaria are going to move towards the light or away from the light? Whether or not they move towards or away, both of those require a direction. So that is a taxic response. It turns out the Planaria actually do not like light, and they will move away from the light. So we would say, from a scientific standpoint, that they exhibit negative phototaxis. If they were to move towards the light, what would we call that? That would be an exhibition of positive phototaxis. So in other words, this is a response to a stimulus that has a directional component to it. Moving on to kinesis, and here is a picture of a Daphnia, which is a common water flea. This is actually an animal, a simple animal. It has a heart and a nervous system. And it also can respond to different stimuli in the environment. And one of the experiments that we did before IB banned them was that we would take Daphnia, which could be in just sort of a beaker of water, and we would, let's say, add some caffeine to the water, add a stimulant. As you can see from this picture, Daphnia's body cavities are transparent, and you can see the organs moving, and you can actually see the heart pumping, and you can take a measurement of how fast the heartbeat is for the Daphnia. So if we added caffeine, what do you think would happen to the heart rate? It would increase. Now, this is not directional. Yes, the number is going up. The number value is changing, but it's not in a physical direction. In other words, the Daphnia is not moving somewhere to or away from a light. It's just that the heartbeat is increasing or decreasing. That's called a kinesis. Some cousins of the Daphnia are woodlice. So woodlice are those little crustaceans that you find in the mulch of decaying logs and tree stumps and whatnot, and they're very responsive to moisture. In a high moisture area, they are more active, so they're moving around more. It's not that they're moving towards or away from the moisture is everywhere. And but when the moisture level goes down and that woodland area starts to dry out, they start to slow down. So even though, again, it's bidirectional as far as speeding up or slowing down, that is an example of kinesis rather than taxis. Well, after that explanation, there's not much to say about this slide. It's just basically a continuation of the previous. Discuss how the process of learning can improve the chance of survival. Now, reading that statement, it may seem like a no-brainer. Of course, learning can improve your chances of survival, but let's differentiate now between innate behavior and learned behavior. If the behavior is innate, for example, babies responding to a breast and wanting to suckle, or a sneeze reflex, that is fixed and that behavior will not change. What might be the problem with that? Well, remember, we have an ever-changing environment, and in order for us to evolve and survive and keep a presence here on Earth, we need to adapt. Well, how can you adapt if you have a pre-programmed fixed behavior that cannot be changed? Well, the way nature dealt with that is it differentiates between innate behavior, which certainly serves its purpose and is very important, but has also given us a second mode of behavior called learning. In this particular picture, you see a chimpanzee using a stick to go inside the tree log to pull out ants. And so it's learned how to use that tool to increase its nutritional yield. That's not something that was programmed in the DNA. That's not something that was innate. That probably is passed on from generation to generation because one chimpanzee watched another one do it, and then they were able to pick up the skill. So that's how learning can improve chances of survival. It's a way of being flexible and refining behavior in such a way that you can have an increased adaptiveness to your environmental conditions. And here we get to the infamous experiment of Ivan Pavlov and his dog. Have you ever heard of the Pavlov's dog experiment? If not, you're about to. And this was a Russian scientist, and that diagram here on the slide is a pretty accurate representation of what he did with the dog. What he did was he would feed the dog, and normally, let's think about this for a second. If a dog sees and smells a bowl of food, what innate response or reflex is going to happen? It's going to salivate. I mean, it's just the smell of the food or the sight of the food or sometimes even the thought of the food will cause us to salivate when we see something that's pleasing. And it's the same thing with the dog. So normally, if the food is put into its visual field of view, it's going to salivate. Well, that was step one. Put the food down, observe the dog salivate in response to sensing the food. Step two was to repeat this over and over and over again, but every time the bowl of food was put in front of the dog, Pavlov ringed a bell. So the bowl would be put down, and he would hear bzzz or ding. I forget which kind of bell he used, but there was some type of noise associated with it. So after multiple repetitions, the dog started to associate the bell with the food and its salivation. So what happened was the food was being paired with a conditioned stimulus, one that you're controlling, which is the bell. What's the purpose of this and what's the ultimate result? Well, if you do this long enough, then what Pavlov observed is that if you don't show the dog the food and don't let it smell the food, but you just ring the bell, guess what the dog's going to do? It's going to salivate, because it learned to associate the bell with the context of salivating in response to the food, and it got to the point where those things were paired so well together that you didn't even need to get the food, that just the ringing of the bell caused the salivation. And that's called an experiment in conditioning. There are some very fascinating and interesting human behavior research experiments involving conditioning, and I'm not going to get into them in a lot of detail here because this is a high school class, but just to give you sort of this sort of bizarre example, imagine that a little baby, a little toddler is crawling around on the floor, and that it's crawling around its mother's legs. Okay, and the mother's wearing a pair of bright red, shiny, high-heeled shoes. Now, another thing that can happen when, kids, this is nothing sexual in any way, but a boy can, like, randomly get an erection. All right, and that's just a sort of a biological response. It doesn't mean that the boy is sexually turned on or anything, but that can. So imagine that the boy happens to get a random erection at a point where it's crawling under his mother's skirt and sees these bright red shoes. Well, that could eventually turn into some sort of fetish that later in life, when the person sees those types of shoes, they get sexually stimulated. So I'm just going to kind of leave it at that, but it just sort of opens the door to kind of these interesting, this interesting concept of conditioning a response to something that normally it wasn't conditioned to. This is a picture of a zebra finch, which is an example of a bird that learns a bird song during a critical period of development when it is a chick. In the zebra finch, that critical window occurs at approximately 20 to 35 days after hatching. So that's the time period where whatever song it hears is going to imprint into the bird, and it's going to associate that with its mating song. So there are some interesting experiments that you can do with birds where you expose them during that critical window to a bird song that comes from a different species, and it's going to imprint that one, and then after that window closes, you can't change it. It's learned the wrong song, so to speak, and will have a very difficult time finding a mate. What's interesting about the learning of bird songs is it sort of hybridizes and combines this concept of innate learning, innate behavior, and learned behavior. Because it's innate that the critical window for the zebra finch is within 20 to 35 days of hatching. That's pre-programmed and remains relatively fixed. But within that window, there is flexibility as far as what the bird can learn. And if it learns the right song, great. If it doesn't learn the right song, there can be problems. That is the end of E3.